Welcome to my review of Splatterhouse for the arcade. And this is actually one of my favorite games from the 16-bit era. Of course, I played it on the TurboGrafx 16. I found the game in I believe it was a Babbage's, which sold a lot of computer games and things at the time and video games. And I believe it was like something like 20 or 30 bucks at the time. And, it was discounted heavily. I think, it probably originally sold for 50 bucks or whatever TurboGrafx 16 games were in the U.S. when the system was still relevant. Though it was always a little bit more rare to even find TurboGrafx games compared to Genesis and Super Nintendo games. They were a lot less common, at least in my area. So when I saw this game in the store for 20 or 30 bucks, it was a really nice fucking surprise. Because my first experience with Splatterhouse was actually Splatterhouse 2 on the Genesis, which was one of my favorite Genesis games. Even to this day, I fucking love the game. And, the presentation was a huge part of that. But beyond the presentation of Splatterhouse 2, initially it feels like clunky and floaty controls, but once you learn the game, it actually has a really tight rhythm to the gameplay and movement. It's a very learnable game. So it's actually really enjoyable once you learn it. Though I actually enjoy the pacing and gameplay of this original game even more than the second game, and I like the atmosphere better, even though it's a little bit of a... it's probably around the same length. I believe both games, Splatterhouse 1 and 2, are around... This game took me maybe... My successful run of the game was 30 minutes, but I had some deaths. But... now that's considering if you don't lose continues and things like that. I'm not counting. I think I probably lost. Well, I think when I went through the game, I definitely lost continues. But you have unlimited continues. But when I say 30 minutes, I'm thinking more along the lines of once I edited out the unsuccessful continues. It actually took me around 4 hours and 7 minutes to beat. And this was beating it again years later. I have beaten this game in the past, but this was a recent playthrough, and I had to, learn the game again. Most of the details I forgot. So it took me about 4 hours and 7 minutes to beat the game again, many, many years later. And there is definitely a few challenging sections, but the game is overall not that difficult. But if you are able to play the game, say you know the game well, you can beat it in about 22 minutes. If you know the game and you don't lose any continues or lives, depending how well you play. It's not a long game. And Splatterhouse 2 is probably only about 25 minutes or so. So they're similar length. I always felt like this one was a little bit shorter for whatever reason, but I think they're actually about the same gameplay length. Very close. So the atmosphere in this game, I think, is one of the best of that time period, and it's still... With the music and everything, I still think it has more atmosphere than, 99% of most modern games. At least to me. It's just a great fucking atmosphere. It's super nostalgic for me as well. Because the TurboGrafx port is actually really close to the arcade version, minus some of the extra gore details. But gameplay-wise, it's nearly identical. And the best home port is on the FM Towns computer, which I also did a playthrough of. I don't think I did a tutorial for that version. But I did do a tutorial for this version, the arcade version, which I will post a link to in my description of the review. But yeah, this is really... I really like, the gameplay pacing, but just the atmosphere of the game. Every time I play it, I really enjoy playing through it again. It's just one of those games that I can always go back to. It's a good example of a game that doesn't need to be super long to be a great game, to be a classic game. Because for me, the shorter length is part of is kind of part of the whole package and pacing to me. It's a real tight package. It could definitely be longer, sure, but I think it would lose some of its, some of the tight design. Because when you start adding a bunch of filler stages and stuff, it could lose some of the atmosphere. I think it's, to me, it feels like the perfect length. And it usually takes me a while to beat anyway. Like I said, it took me around 4 hours, a little bit over 4 hours to beat anyway. So it wasn't like it was short for me to get through it. So unless you really know the game, it's gonna take several hours. It can easily take much longer depending on your skill level. It can be tough. It's not an easy game, but it's really not that difficult once you learn it. It's more of really learning your movement patterns. You can memorize a flow through each stage. So once you know the flow of the stage, you can memorize a lot of it. Now, I believe some parts do feel a little random, like the guys that break out of the mirrors, or clones of you that break out of the mirrors, which I just showed. That part can feel very random. But most of it is pretty learnable, I would say. And I'm sure you could probably learn to manipulate the game, obviously, to where things happen the same each time with certain parts that may seem random, but they're probably not. I didn't learn the game to that level, like a speedrun type of level or anything like that. Now, each stage also has multiple paths you can pick often, so that gives some replay too, because if you're having trouble on one path, you can try a different path. You also get different enemies and things in those different paths, so there's replay there just to, to see all the different areas and stuff, so there's a little replay with that. It definitely adds to the stages. It makes some of the stages probably about twice as long as they would be, with a lot more unique areas. So that was a cool thing, especially back then. You didn't really see that with these linear type of games back then where there was multiple paths. I'm not even sure if Splatterhouse 2 carried that over from what I remember. It's been a while since I played through Splatterhouse 2. I don't remember that much in Splatterhouse 2, if at all. Now, the reason I only talk about Splatterhouse 1 and 2 in this review is because Splatterhouse 3 was really a Streets of Rage wannabe game that was really inferior to the other two Splatterhouse games, in my opinion, and also way worse than any of the good beat 'em ups that were out at the time. So it just, for me, it really lost everything that made the previous two games awesome. I mean, it did have great music and presentation. That's the only thing that it had from the other two games. But the gameplay was just so weak to me. And I did a review and a tutorial on Splatterhouse 3 as well, and Splatterhouse 2. So check those out. That boss I just showed here, that's actually the hardest boss in the game, at least for me. It's a tricky boss. I do break it down in the tutorial for some good strategies that are very easy to replicate. So if you are having trouble with that, or just the game in general, if you want something entertaining, play through the game. You may find it entertaining. And if you're looking to beat the game, it should give you a lot of details and save you a lot of trial and error. There's a nice variety of stages. Here you're just killing these fetuses and bubbles for most of the stage. And eventually you'll get to the end where you have to take out the heart. Not much different than what you would do in a Contra game or something, except you don't have guns here, so. But the presentation is just top notch. Sometimes when you kill the bosses, they will explode and damage you, or something will fall on your head or something. So usually when they're going into the death animation, you usually want to move out. The gore is really well done too, especially for the time, but it still looks great. And I'm not showing the music here, but the soundtrack is among the best as well. It's a great soundtrack, super memorable, one of the best of that time period, for sure. And I prefer this game over the second game, even though the second game, it seems like maybe it tried to add a few things, but I feel like the visuals here just look better, the atmosphere's better, the gameplay's better, and it's hard for me to explain exactly why that is, but this game doesn't feel as repetitive to me, maybe because there's more diversity in the backgrounds and enemies and things than the second game, which seems to recycle more stuff. I love the second game, still one of my favorite Genesis games, but to me this has a considerable lead to me. I always like this game better than the second game. It was the second one that I played, but I ended up, in the end, liking it better than the second game. Final Boss is very cool. Has some of the best soundtrack of the entire game as well, which is fitting for the end of the game. But very cool Final Boss. And it's challenging. It definitely takes some practice to get down the movements and dodging patterns. But really, the hardest part of this game is really that fourth boss, where your girlfriend transforms into a monster. That's the toughest part of the game, I would say. Aside from that, I wouldn't say the game is really that difficult. But it's definitely challenging. I mean, it's definitely a challenging game. And if you're not used to these kind of games, it can be very difficult, I'm sure. But if you've played a lot of these type of games, then, you can probably beat it in a few hours. It shouldn't be anything extreme. For an arcade game, it's one of the more moderate ones for sure, because, arcade games can be brutally difficult, much harder than most console games, even NES games. Just because of the power of the arcade machines, to put so many sprites on screen. And the fact that they're motivated to take your money makes a lot of arcade games much, much harder than a lot of console games, on average. But this one, for an arcade game, this is a nice difficulty. This is more in line with your typical console game of the time, rather than a brutal arcade game. So it's a good moderate game of this style, difficulty-wise. But it's one of my favorites as far as, games that I like to revisit and play through. I'll always play through this game. So for me, I'd give this a 9 out of 10. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.